thank you, Tom, for this interview. We really appreciate your time to have this conversation about one of the works you have developed through different studies, which is embodiment. And the first question I would like to start with is, how did you become interested in the study of embodiment?
I became interested because as an anthropologist, I wanted to understand human experience. Experience in the literal sense of what people go through in the course of their lives and the challenges that they face, the immediate experience that they encounter. And at the time when I was being trained, there was no concern for experience per se. As a matter of fact, among anthropologists, it was thought that experience was inaccessible, and only culture has systems of symbols, in Geertz's term, or as forms of textuality, in Derrida's terms, were accessible. That experience was beyond the reach of anthropology, and I didn't like that. I was even told by my PhD advisor, be careful about experience, you know, people will criticize you for using that. So I searched around for ways to think about it, and I became exposed to phenomenology, which is, you know, the description of phenomena as they appear to humans. And in reading through different phenomenology texts, like Alfred Schutz, for example, a little bit of Heidegger, I became exposed to the thinking of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who talked about embodiment, who talked about perception as a form of experience that was grounded in embodiment. And that appealed to me, and it struck me as the way in, the access point to experience. That is, the access point to experience would be through perception, which can only be understood in terms of bodily experience, embodiment. And that's how I became interested in it. I became interested particularly through the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty and his very important work, The Phenomenology of Perception, where he elaborates a form of existential analysis grounded in embodiment and highly relevant to culture and cultural experience.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. That's something interesting, and we can see that in your work as well, when you integrate all these discussions that Merleau-Ponty elaborated around perception. And something that is clear also in this, you said that you become interested on the experience, and it definitely probably had to do as well with the kind of topics you were researching at the time. And which were some of the reflections, thinking on all these theoretical, phenomenological perspective around experience, and in relation to the topics that you were looking at the field, or you were researching at the field. So which were the reflections that preceded your proposal of the processes of embodiment that you elaborated more deeply in the two articles, Embodiment as a Paradigm of Anthropology, for Anthropology, and Somatic Modes of Attention?
It's always been evident to me that experience is accessible through certain kinds of human activity more readily than others. And I was very interested in religion, and therefore very interested in religious experience. I was interested in religion because it was an aspect of human activity where experience was close to the surface. And I was interested in experience because it would help understand religion, which is a very critical aspect of human activity. So the relationship of interest in religion and experience were reciprocal with one another. And within that interest, I was concerned not just with religion and religious experience, but specifically with transformation. How religion had that rhetorical force for transformation. So I began studying not just systems of religion, but particularly religious movements that were interested in that the goal of which was to transform society, right? As a collective force. And I also became interested in religious healing rituals, which were a way to transform experience on the more personal and individual level, to transform self from an afflicted self to a healthy self. Mm-hmm. So those were the kinds of interests that led me to use this thinking about embodiment to gain access to it. So I was interested in religion and religious experience, and embodiment was a way to get into it. It wasn't an easy way to get into it because the thinking about embodiment was through Merleau-Ponty was dense, let's say. It was intellectually dense. And I applied it to the religious movement that I was working on and the forms of healing I was working on within the Catholic charismatic renewal movement. And so I wanted to elaborate the idea of embodiment in a useful way. And so I examined my ethnographic data on the religious movement and religious forms of healing in order to formulate the idea of embodiment better. Right? So I used religious data in order to formulate a method, a methodological stance, or a paradigm of embodiment. Mm-hmm. It took me literally 13 years from the time that I started thinking about embodiment to the time that I was able to publish those articles that you mentioned. Embodiment as a paradigm for anthropology first, and somatic modes of attention second. And I must say that those two articles actually started out as one long article. They were very closely related. The first part setting out the idea of embodiment, and the second giving an example of the kind of category you can identify somatic modes of attention if you think within this paradigm of embodiment. But at first it was a very unwieldy and long piece. And thanks to the advice and consultation and reflection of my closest colleague, Janice Jenkins, who suggested that they be divided into two separate articles, we have what exists now, two separate pieces: embodiment as a paradigm for anthropology and somatic modes of attention. And I will be forever grateful for her for that, advice on how to make a very long and dare I say ponderous and dense piece into two somewhat more accessible and coherent articles. And I should say I'm also very grateful that the Somatic Modes of Attention piece exists now in Spanish translation in the volume edited by Silvia Citro.
Yes, in Cuerpos Plurales, which is the name of the book. And it's in dialogue in some way with other works so interesting around the discussions about the body. And something in that direction as well, and related to what you're saying, you said that you were at the beginning like thinking on the experience because culture was mainly approached from a symbolic framework, and patterns were trying to be found in the notion of culture. And something that you were more interested on was in the lived experience of this dimension. And what you develop in the paradigm of embodiment, it's an approach, a methodological stance to approach the self and culture and the body as an existential ground of culture. So it's evident that even though the word body is present in your work, there's a difference in the way you're approaching the study of embodiment than what has been developed before in the anthropology of the body. So you're not talking about the body, but the embodiment, which could be understood or even reflected and analyzed from a different perspective. Could you elaborate in this sense on the difference between the anthropology of the body and embodiment as a paradigm for anthropology?
In the most basic terms, the anthropology of the body understands the body as an object, a cultural object or social object, and the paradigm of embodiment understands that the body is a subject, that is a subject of experience. And part of the way I always remind myself of that difference is that from the standpoint of embodiment, I never use the article, the, to refer to the body. It's not the body that we're interested in. It's my body and your body and our bodies as living, breathing entities that are the existential ground of self and culture. A slightly more elaborate way of making the distinction in terms of approaches within the field, we have an anthropology of the body, like we just said, but that typically treats the body either as a source of symbols, a microcosm of society, for example, or it treats the body as an object of analysis in its own right, insofar as it can be manipulated and controlled and transformed by social forces. So that's the anthropology of the body. There's also a study within anthropology and related fields of nonverbal communication, like kinesics and proxemics and gesture, where the body is conceived primarily as a means or medium of communication, and where analysis is often based on a linguistic analogy, as in referring to various types of languages of the body. And then there's the anthropology of the senses, which focuses on the body as a cultural filter and shaper of reality. And sometimes in this approach, each sense is a culturally formed modality of perception. And sometimes it's approached in terms of how the senses are differentially synthesized into an integrated sensorium across cultures. Finally, the fourth approach, cultural phenomenology of embodiment, is where my work is starting from and is grounded. examining the body as being in the world. And it requires recognition that culture is more than symbol and meaning, but also includes experience. And that our bodies are at the same time the wellspring of existence, the source of movement, and the site of experience.
And would you say that in this sense, what you have developed in the paradigm of embodiment could be complementary of other approaches to the study of human experience, where the body is, or not human experiences, but where the body is approached for other phenomena?
Yes, absolutely complementary. And I think all four of those approaches I just mentioned are complementary to one another. And of course, you know, embodiment is not the only way to approach culture. It's not that it's not. I'm not saying it's. There's no value in thinking of culture as a system of symbols. I'm not saying there's no value in thinking of culture as a set of adaptations to our environment, or that culture is a set of practices and customs. I also want to say, however, that culture is a fundamental way of describing what we take for granted about ourselves and the world and other people. And that taken for grantedness, understanding that taken for grantedness can begin from our bodily experience.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. They could be complementary, and because they lead you to different aspects of the human being. And one of the arguments that I find so interesting and intriguing in your proposal, and I think that it makes a difference in between other approaches to the study of the body or our bodies, is that your proposal focuses on the collapsed dualities, objective, subjective, perception, practice, body, mind, subject, object, something that is present in your arguments. And I think that it challenges perspectives from different disciplines approaching the study of human beings in social sciences. And it provides as well a renewed understanding of diverse processes that live by human beings. Nonetheless, and I know that you're aware of some of the critiques that have been developed that state that the arguments sustaining the proposal of embodiment still carry a dualistic view of human beings. And for instance, Fresnel argues that Bourdieu's notion of habitus, which provides a basis for the generation of practices, doesn't recognize an agentive person. Fresnel states that the process of generation, the social cultural content generated and subsequent adjustments to external constraints of the social world are all apparently unconscious or less than conscious, like arguing that the human being is not perceived as an agent and as a reflective person or subject. How would you react to the critiques about the dualistic view in your notion of embodiment?
Well, first of all, I think that perspective on Bourdieu is interesting, and there's some merit to it, because Bourdieu is so concerned about showing how the world is taken for granted and that dispositions are inculcated into people's bodies and sedimented into people's lives, that he does neglect agency. And that's in part why I found him useful and interesting, but that's also in part why I found it important to juxtapose his work with that of Merleau-Ponty, who does talk about, or who in whose work the idea of agency is deeply embedded. The idea of agency and intentionality, because one's body is always oriented toward and moving toward the world. So whereas Merleau-Ponty talks about the body toward the world, Bourdieu talks about the world being embedded and in our bodies. So that critique does hold some weight, I think. But the problem of dualism in general is simply present in contemporary thinking since the Enlightenment. I mean, dualism is a starting point against which one reacts. So it's always there as a point of reference, even if negatively, even if we're concerned with collapsing the dualities, they're there and they keep returning. And the dialectic process is to recognize that duality is present and it can be collapsed and it reemerges again, and then we want to collapse it again. What we're reacting against is the rigidity of duality, and the primary duality is the duality between mind and body. That always gets traced to René Descartes. Right? And in some quarters, Descartes is regarded as bad because he, distinguished between mind and body and made it hard for us to put them back together again. Well, in some respects, they were always together. In some respects, it's always possible to distinguish them. And, maybe Descartes is not as guilty as we think he is. Maybe it's us who have reified and rigidified the distinction between mind and body, and even more so than Descartes himself did. I think the problem is of duality that we have to struggle against is only a problem when the dualities, such as the duality between mind and body or subject and object, are regarded as mutually exclusive. That they are opposed. Right? That they're antagonistic to one another. Or even more so, that one side of the duality dominates the other and is therefore oppressive. And in that sense, the duality of mind and body is something to be struggled against. If mind is regarded as superior to body, that should be struggled against. If body is regarded as superior to mind, that is, biology determines everything, that has to be struggled against. So the problem is not duality per se, the problem is duality that is rigidified and reified. So it becomes important to collapse the dualities, to see what happens, to escape the prison of rigidified duality. And in doing that, we can also recognize that if there's two sides of things, they don't have to be regarded or thought of as rigid dualities. They can be thought of polarities. They can be thought of as ends of a continuum. And we can, take inspiration from the poet William Blake, who said that contraries are positives. There's two positive sides of this polarity. It's not one is positive and one is negative. It's not one is good and one is bad. It's not one is dominant and one is inferior, but both sides of the polarity are positive. So struggling against duality can be done by collapsing the dualities. It can also be done by recognizing that there can be duality without dualism, without it becoming an ideology.
And then from this point, what you're elaborating, collapsing dualities will definitely lead us to another aspect of human beings. As you're saying, like the polarities, we can see not the opposition in between aspects of the human being, but as a continuous process, like continuum in between those polarities. So if you can elaborate a little bit more, what's at the core of this perspective of collapsing dualities that could help us to grasp your arguments better, and especially thinking about human experience, because that's something that it's at the core of the paradigm of embodiment, like perceiving object and subject collapsed, body and mind collapsed. And that's something that it's part of the process of understanding human experience. We don't experience ourselves as divided or separated.
Right.
So what can you elaborate more around that?
Well, we can experience, that's the point, is that we can experience ourselves as divided and separated. And we can experience ourselves as dualistic beings. But what we want to avoid is being trapped in the prison of duality, of dualism. I think the answer is precisely what I was saying about the liberating aspect of collapsing dualities, and the liberating aspect of thinking of dualities as polarities, as positive polarities. Those things are what it's at the core of that perspective.
And well, thinking about the different experiences you have approached from the perspective of embodiment. For example, in some cases, you have approached the overlapping between religion and health, as you said at the beginning, like the studies of charismatic Catholics and indigenous healing processes. Something that is present there is religion and health in those processes of embodiment. And in some others, explicitly focus on mental health processes. For example, your study around adolescents in psychiatric treatments as well, and where mental health is an important, a fundamental aspect of the analysis. What have you found compelling about using this approach for the study of human experiences, using the embodiment approach for the study of those different human experiences?
The main thing that I find compelling is that it gives access to immediacy. The concrete immediacy presence that one has to tap into as a level of analysis, as a starting point for understanding human experience. It's in the immediacy. This is why it's useful to start with perception. And if you start with the immediacy of perception, then you can approach any other question, right? You can approach the question of why does immediacy appear as it does, as the phenomenon it does, and that allows you to approach structural issues, right? It's not studying experience instead of structural issues. It's studying experience as a starting point, as a way in, right? The immediacy of experience. So, you're not interested only, for example, in the laws that allow or prohibit refugees from crossing a border. You're also interested in, and you want to start with, the experience of the refugee as they try to cross the border and succeed or fail with that. You're not only interested in the structural violence of a healthcare system that imposes itself on people who are afflicted, but you want to start with the experience of those people as they try to navigate and have trajectories through those healthcare systems, so that you can understand, by understanding their experience, you can approach the institutional and structural aspects of it as well. Because there are anthropologists and social scientists who are only concerned with the structural aspects, and they eventually forget about the experience of the people who are living through and living in those settings.
And well, regarding all this elaboration around how to approach phenomenon from the paradigm of embodiment, you talk about the processes of embodiment. So we can, if we understand this as a process, we can also identify some stages in this process. And it has to do with which is the starting point, which is the first stage that I elaborate to approach a human experience from the embodiment perspective. And you talk about the immediacy as a starting point, the perception, the pre-objective, the pre-reflective aspect of this perception. And then to elaborate in further as the processes of objectification of the self, for example. So pre-objective self, and then the objectification of the self. And it's clear that we can identify like these different stages in the processes of embodiment. But I would like to know if these processes are lived by human beings according to these stages that we analytically are elaborating to approach the embodiment. Is this a linear process in human experience? Is this a continuous process, or is a back and forth process? Is a dynamic process where human beings are moving back and forth? And what can you elaborate around that?
Well, it's dynamic and it's iterative, and the process of the immediacy that we're talking about does lead to various forms of objectification, because we have to think in terms of concepts, we have to think in terms of institutions, we have to think of how we communicate with other people, how we think about ourselves. And so there's the pre-objective self processes, and then there are the objectifications that we are constantly performing on ourselves. Objectifications and re-objectifications and de-objectifications. Right. And objectifications that are necessary to live in society, and objectifications that are alienating to ourselves. But it's a constant iterative back and forth process.
That's how it is understood in human experience, like a dynamic back and forth process. And it goes along with this analytical perspective that we are like trying to identify the process starting from the pre-objective to the objectification, even thought those processes are lived probably at the same time by human beings.
Yeah, it's not a linear process. It's a process that goes back and forth from pre-objective to objective, and also, I mean, you can think of it as simultaneous,
mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, simultaneously, I'm experiencing the immediacy of this conversation we're having, but at the same moment, I'm objectified by you and me as someone who has something to say about embodiment. Right. And so those are simultaneous. It's not, it's you know, not linear in that sense either.
Mm-hmm. Something that I think we should also approach, given your experience, because in different of your articles, books, and chapters, you're always elaborating these arguments, but also giving us the empirical material. You're talking about cases, so it's very clear to see how you are getting to the ground all these reflections. And I think that's something that is so illustrative. Something that I would like to know about this is understanding embodiment as a methodological stance places us under the task of approaching a phenomenon considering an ethnographic perspective, which is present in a lot of the works you have developed. And in these terms, and in very technical terms, which would you say that are the essential research techniques to study the processes of embodiment, thinking about all this complexity that about human experience that we will be analyzing if we want to approach these human experiences from the perspective of embodiment?
Well, the essential research technique is ethnography. It's as simple as that. There's nothing different about the kind of work that I do that any other anthropologist necessarily does. What's important and what's distinctive, perhaps, is that embodiment is, in the phrase that you just used, a methodological stance. It's a way of approaching the data of ethnography. It's not that the data are different, it's just that one's stance in relation to the data are different. The starting point is the starting point of experience and immediacy that we access through embodiment. So that's the real thing. The answer is very simple. The technique is ethnography, but what's significant is how you approach and orient toward that material.
Mm-hmm. And I'm asking this because I have read some arguments that, for example, if we think in narrative identities and we are doing interviews, we keep only the discourse of the people, the narratives they are telling us about something. And something that has been developed by some authors is that to approach the study of bodies, we need to go beyond narratives. But in this sense, would you say that is it fundamental to do ethnographic observation as well? Or depending on how we approach the material present in interviews, we can also keep just this data and approach the human experience from the perspective of embodiment?
Yeah, that's a very good question and a very important one. So observation certainly is important. I mean, insofar as one of the fundamental aspects of our bodies is how we move them and how we are persuaded to move them or trained to move them, it's important to observe those movements. However, it's also the case that language discloses, to use Heidegger's term, discloses our being and discloses something about our experience and discloses something about our embodiment and our movement. So, we can learn about embodiment in part through narrative and discourse. Right? And I would insist on that in the same vein as we were talking about before, that if you are trapped or imprisoned in the duality, the dualism between language and experience, then you're also tying yourself up, right? So language and experience is another duality that we want to collapse, that we want to understand how they interpenetrate one another.
And while thinking about this way to approach the human experience, would you say that the paradigm of embodiment is more suitable for studying some human experiences than for others?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's the case, and that goes back to what I was starting with. I said, I'm interested in religion, and embodiment is, yes, especially suited for the study of religion. Probably more so than for the study of political economy. Which is not to say, again, that I want to make an absolute distinction between the study of religion and the study of political economy, because one can find bodily experience in the alienation of labor. Mm-hmm. So again, that's a duality we would like to collapse. At the same time as saying there are certain aspects of life that are more susceptible to study via the paradigm of embodiment or the methodological stance of embodiment. And there are some where embodiment is not as close to the surface of the phenomenon. So for example, well, I think religion is a very good example. The example that I was just making, and even in my own work and my own writing, there are some things that I've done where embodiment is not in the forefront of what I'm thinking about. Sometimes I have written about language without very much reference to embodiment. Or in the new book that Janice Jenkins and I have just published, Troubled in the Land of Enchantment, our study of adolescence in psychiatric care. It's not a book of embodiment. It's a book, but it is a book of lived experience. Mm-hmm. So within that study of lived experience, there are places in the book that our bodies become somewhat relevant, but not as much as in some of the writings I've done about religion. So not everything is about embodiment. Mm-hmm. And embodiment as a methodological stance may not always be the most relevant starting point.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and regarding this book, which is so interesting, and I really recommend people to take a look on the book, but something that has to do with embodiment is one article related to this study you did with adolescents, which is Living with 1,000 Cuts, which is so interesting the way you analyze the experience of cutting in regards to embodiment and also in relation to agency and the relationship in between the individual and the world. So that's something that probably is not the book about embodiment, but definitely your perspective about embodiment has been in the different works you have developed.
And I think that's a very good observation, because although that book is not about embodiment, there are aspects of embodiment that are highly relevant to the experience of those young people. and that's precisely why, with my eye toward toward bodily experience, I picked that practice of cutting and self-cutting and said, aha, that's where embodiment is. And so I separated it out and we made that separate article about cutting, precisely because it was an aspect of it that was susceptible to an analysis from the standpoint of embodiment, and actually invited analysis from the standpoint of embodiment.
Mm-hmm. And well, before concluding, I would like to ask you, now that we are living a pandemic and every study, every research is trying to adapt to this new circumstance in order to develop field work, for example. In this case, what challenges do we face during the pandemic to approach the processes of embodiment in the field? So in particular, what makes different to do field work right now and to analyze the data we could collect in these circumstances to be approached from the paradigm of embodiment or from this methodological stance?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind there is the experience that's being described increasingly frequently of what's being called long COVID, long COVID, long term. People who get the illness and who think they're better and they're not, or the illness lasts for months and months, and it keeps emerging in different symptoms that they recognize and associate with the disease. And there are increasing accounts, experiential accounts of people who are suffering with this unique version of COVID. So I suspect that if we looked very closely at their experiences, we would find that there is in our society and culture emerging a new somatic mode of attention that is a way of attending to and with our bodies, a new somatic mode of attention that's distinctly characteristic of people who have long COVID. And that's one distinct place, a very clear place, I think, where thinking in terms of embodiment can help us or lead us to an understanding or analysis of what's going on with this. Another thing that's striking in terms of bodily experience or fears of our own bodies is anti-vaccination ideology, the anti-vaxxers. What is their experience and perception of their own bodies that lead them to have more fear of the vaccination than they do of the disease? And that's yet another place where thinking from the methodological stance of embodiment can be useful in the pandemic environment. And also going beyond the pandemic, to our larger social situation, one could ask, what is the bodily experiential grounding of race hatred and misogyny that we see more and more in society? How does embodiment, how can we understand the actual visceral experience of hatred, that's race hatred or misogyny, that we see in society? Because that's a bodily phenomenon, or at least it can be understood from the standpoint bodily experience.
And something that came to my mind while you were talking about all these ways we could go, and currently, what about our relationship with the technology under these circumstances? Because when you talk about somatic modes of attention as a way, culturally elaborated ways of paying attention to and with our bodies in the surroundings where there is an embodied presence of others. So now there are interactions are being mediated by technology in different circumstances. What can we reflect about embodiment processes there?
Well, let's talk about our conversation right now. It's by Zoom, right? We're in little rectangles instead of sitting across from one another at the table, and that affects the nature of our embodied intersubjectivity, or to use a phrase I like, a word I like very much, intercorporality. Right? That's profoundly affected by the technology that we're all using now. There's also the idea that we are looking at one another. I mean, we're looking at ourselves. I can see myself. I can never, in any real embodied conversation, you don't look at yourself, right? You're looking only at the other person. And so that has an embodied effect as well. And in fact, I've observed that in classes, in teaching online, some students are very anxious about turning on their cameras, and it's because, I think, of the fundamental alterity that's built into our embodiment. There's a sense of otherness that we have in ourselves toward ourselves. Right? We're not always one with ourselves. And the fact that you're looking at yourself all the time on Zoom implicitly brings that out in a way that can be very disturbing and disconcerting to people. And so some students I've had just get very anxious in not, they'd be anxious participating in a seminar anyway, but seeing themselves there, right? And another aspect of our technology, right? Everybody who's been on Zoom observes that, when you've been on Zoom for an hour and you finish, you feel like you've been working for 3 hours. It's physically that much more exhausting. So that's yet another way the Zoom technology affects our embodiment. And finally, I read something. This is not about technology itself, but it's about the quarantine aspect of the pandemic, of which our reliance on Zoom is a part. I read an article that talked about how injuries to people's toes have increased dramatically. There's an epidemic of toe injuries, broken toes, sprained toes. Why? Because people are in their house and they're more likely to walk around barefoot. And, there's stuff in the way, and people are, bumping into things with their toes and hurting themselves. This is a bodily, unintended consequence of quarantine. So, you don't know whether I'm wearing shoes now. I am, as it happened. But if I wasn't, we could finish this conversation and I immediately get up and, break my toe by bumping it on the table.
Yeah, so the way not only we experience our bodies, but also the way we move around, we interact, we experience our bodies in this space or interact with the space or our surroundings is definitely affected by this situation or health emergency we are living. Mm-hmm. And though you have pointed out so interesting points to think about. And the last question I would like to elaborate is, we are finishing, is you started, well, it took you 13 years to publish something. So, and the first publication was in the 90s. So we are like 30 years from then. And you have continued elaborating this perspective in the different works you have developed in all this time. Is there something that have changed in these new elaborations or approaches, analytical approaches to specific phenomena from what you have written in the 90s about it? Or are you still elaborating something new in this approach of embodiment?
Yeah, there have been some developments in my thinking about embodiment since then. Two articles in particular that I'll mention. One that I published in 2004 called Asymptote of the Ineffable. In that article was in a way, a companion piece to embodiment as a paradigm for anthropology. Insofar as in the first article, embodiment as a paradigm, I took ethnographic data from religion, and I used it in order to elaborate this paradigm of embodiment and explain what I was trying to mean by embodiment. And part of why it took such a long time is precisely, as you said, that I insisted on doing that not in the abstract, but by working through concrete ethnographic data from religion. So I used the data of religion to elaborate the idea of embodiment. An asymptote of the ineffable, I reversed that strategy and used the idea of embodiment to make a contribution to the understanding and the theory of religion. So instead of using religion to elaborate embodiment, I used embodiment to make a statement about religion. And it was based precisely on what I was just referring to, this essential otherness or alterity that's structured within our bodies. That's an elementary structure of existence, if you will. And saying that this alterity that is fundamentally structured into our embodiment is the phenomenological kernel that gets elaborated into religion. So we were able to think about and recognize and experience otherness, the divine otherness of the grandiose God, or the otherness that threatens us via witchcraft, or the otherness of a spirit that we're in conversation with. That kind of religious sensibility has its primordial aspect in our own embodiment. And that's what I was talking about in that. And the second elaboration of embodiment that I've been working on comes from an article that was published in the Blackwell Companion to the Anthropology of Body and Embodiment. And it's on cultural phenomenology, elaborating embodiment from the standpoint of agency, sexual difference, and illness. And in that article, I challenged myself because in the earlier writings, I defined embodiment as an indeterminate methodological field caught up in a discourse and experienced as activity and production. And eventually I looked back at that and said, how did I get away with saying that? Because it's pretty cryptic. And I challenged myself, okay, that's how I defined embodiment, but what do I mean by an indeterminate methodological field? And so this article that I published in 2011 talks about, it goes on to elaborate that, what I'm talking about by embodiment as an indeterminate methodological field, in terms of agency, sexual difference, and illness, but also juxtaposing our corporality itself to other methodological fields, such as animality. How does our human embodiment relate to animals and animality? And materiality. How does our human embodiment relate to the methodological field of matter and materiality? I won't say anything more about that because we're at the end of our conversation, and that's an unfinished piece of thinking that I still want to work on in the future, so that we can continue to elaborate the idea of embodiment.
Yes, definitely. This is a good way to finish as well, because I'm sure that the people will be interested on looking on these publications or recent publications you have, where we can find more elaboration about this paradigm, and definitely is something that we can see in your trajectory working on this paradigm. And it's good to and refreshing, like, to see how this continues, and this is, as the embodiment process, something is that is dynamic as well as alive, and as you said, it gives us renewed ways to approach some ethnographic data, and it is still continue to do that through these new elaborations that you're sharing with us. I really appreciate this conversation, Dr. Thomas Csordas, and I really enjoyed. I hope you also did it.
I've enjoyed it immensely, Olga, and thanks to you and thanks to Renee for inviting me to participate in this. It's been fun and enjoyable, and thank you.